I'm joined today by Jack Jedwab, president of the Association for Canadian Studies, which is one of the partners of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. Jack, the ACS recently conducted a survey on Canadians' knowledge of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was created in 1982. So I'm going to ask you about some of the findings, particularly related to religion. But before we get into that, what jumped out to you from the survey? Some of the big findings, I guess.
Well, I think the most interesting finding from the survey on the Charter of Rights for me was the extent to which people who purportedly read the Charter actually had knowledge about its contents. I was struck, though not entirely surprised, that a lot of people who said quite clearly that they've read the Charter of Rights were unaware of very specific aspects of it when I did the sort of correlation between those having said they've read the charter and asked about specific provisions. And the one that surprised me most, to be fair, was about the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So that you've got sort of 1/3 of Canadians saying that they've read the charter, but then you've got about another sort of third that seem to disagree that phrase is part of the charter, which in effect they must have skipped over the beginning of the charter if they said they've read it, because it's sort of in your face right at the front, if you like, if you've actually looked at it. So my sense is that people who say that, those who haven't read it, have a greater tendency to speak to the issues that as they sort of prefer them or don't prefer. So if they don't like the idea of our rights being framed or through the prism of the supremacy of God and the rule of law, and I think it's more about the supremacy of God in this case than the rule of law, then they'll respond in the negative. Would ask whether that's part of the charter, simply because what they're telling us is they don't like the fact that it's part of the charter.
Yeah, I was also surprised to learn a few years ago. I didn't realize as well about the statement which is in the preamble about um, which says Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, like you mentioned. Um, so in your findings in general, did Canadians agree with that statement?
No, they were divided about that statement when asked about whether Canada was founded upon the supremacy of God and the rule of law. They were sort of divided almost into three parts, if you like: those who agree with the idea, those who disagree with the idea, and those who don't know. There are significant differences between Quebec and the rest of Canada around that. So my assumption is, given that Quebec, in survey after survey that we've undertaken, has a tendency to favor things that are more secular, that they were put off by that statement to a greater extent than were other Canadians. And so only 25% of Canadians agreed with that statement, and sort of within the 40% range for the rest of Canada in terms of agreement with that statement. So reflecting, I would think, the gap in the extent to which people within Quebec and outside of Quebec support those type of if you like, religious underpinnings with respect to the founding of the country. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that if you agree with such a statement that it makes you less secular or more secular. It's just sort of something that speaks to the way in which we understand the foundations of the country. So, but, I do think, because of the way in which Quebec responded, that some of the uh, overall reply, if you'd like, to that phrase is being influenced by one's perspective on the place of religion in our society and whether one is more secular or less secular.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think that's a good kind of clarification or nuance to add to that. I also wanted to ask about this issue of freedom of religion. In the survey, did you find that uh, freedom of religion is an important value for Canadians?
Well, yes and no, because the way the survey is constructed, it asks about the rank order from your perspective of what rights you think are most vulnerable in Canada at present. So it's not asking you to look at each one of those particular rights independently and weigh their importance. It's saying which of the following on a list we provided do you think is more or less important? And what Canadians felt was most important was freedom of expression and the right to privacy. The provisions of the charter that tend to have an impact on groups disproportionately as opposed to individuals didn't fare as well. So that, for example, protection of language minorities didn't fare very well. It came out very low on the list, as did freedom of religion, though freedom of religion can be viewed both as an individual and a collective right. But I think increasingly Canadians are seeing freedom of religion as something that affects collectivities as opposed to affecting individuals, like freedom of conscience or something there such, and may see freedom of expression as the way in which people speak to the sort of religious predilections they may wish to defend or protect or not. So, but my sense again in that particular question and then the way in which the responses were offered is that people tend to feel the priority is more about what affects them individually. So to the extent that they don't belong to a language minority in this case, or don't belong to a religious minority, they may not see those rights as vulnerable because they're not feeling any particular threat directed at their identity on that personal level. And I think we're increasingly seeing that distinction being drawn between, what affects us individually more directly, things like our privacy, our ability to express ourselves, and less impact, if you like, or on us personally, and thereby potentially less interest in what may be disproportionately affecting minorities. Again, depending on how the question's framed. But when the question's framed in that particular way, where the Canadians are probably speaking to what they think on that personal level is affecting them most. And right now, that's what their perception appears to be. Right? If there's a big issue tomorrow, I would suggest that, gets a lot of attention that involves a language minority, a particular religious minority, then were I to do that poll again, you may get a different set of answers. But in terms of what the current context is, is displaying for respondents, that's how they're answering those types of questions.
Yeah, and kind of following on from that, how do you think the changing religious context of in Canada is kind of shaping views about freedom of religion or this issue of the clause about the supremacy of God in the Charter, particularly the rise of the non-religious in Canada? How do you think that's changing things?
Well, I think it's interesting that we don't have a public debate about those issues. Where we'd have a public debate about the issue of whether people wanted our constitution and charter to include something about the supremacy of God, my sense it wouldn't do very well right now. In the same way that Quebec recently, in terms of the oath of office, right, the oath of allegiance rather, to take office as an elected official, got pushed back quite significantly by in this case it was the Parti Québécois in Quebec, but the Quebec legislature did adopt a motion that enabled those legislators not to take that oath of allegiance to the crown, if you like, right? Which is, so in that's because there was public debate about it. It was almost a convention, if you like, that became a sort of taboo thing to raise. So it wasn't raised. It's been out there for some time in terms of pledging allegiance to the monarchy, both for parliamentarians and for new citizens. And yet, it's got the occasional sort of person or persons who've said, "Hey, we're not a part of the British Empire. We're not part of the monarchy. Why do we need to do this?" And it's the symbolism of it that's that people I suspect accept. But were you to have a public debate right now about the supremacy of God, not the rule of law, but supremacy of God, you sort of break them up. It probably wouldn't do very well in a society where the non-religion portion is continuing to become far more present in our demographic, or if you like, socio-demographic reality.
All right. Okay. Thanks so much, Jack. It was great getting your perspective on this and learning more about the results of the survey.